He's a billionaire. His son, diagnosed with severe autism, never spoke, never smiled, and never laughed. Not once. Every expert failed. Every method led to silence. Until one day, a new maid was hired. No experience, no titles, just heart. And then in the kitchen, she did something so simple, yet so powerful, that for the first time in his life, the boy burst into laughter, and everything changed. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield was a billionaire who made his fortune in agribusiness. After his wife passed away, he stopped spending time on anything else and chose to live in complete isolation with his only son, Leo. They lived in a huge mansion filled with everything money could buy, but the place always felt cold and empty. Even with all the luxury, the house didn't feel like a home. Leo had been diagnosed with autism and didn't speak, didn't laugh, and never showed signs of connection. Richard didn't know how to reach him. He spent his days walking through the quiet halls of the mansion, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Every room reminded him of what he had lost and how alone he and his son had become. Despite not knowing how to help Leo, Richard refused to give up. He hired several professionals over the years, all experts in child development. Most of them left after a few months, saying Leo showed no reaction to their techniques. Then came Dr. Adrian Keller, a well-known therapist with impressive qualifications. Richard thought maybe this was the breakthrough they needed. Dr. Keller spoke confidently, explained the challenges of Leo's condition, and told Richard that progress would be slow. He said there was no magic solution and that Leo's development would depend on long, continuous therapy sessions. Richard listened carefully to every word, desperate for hope. Dr. Keller became a regular visitor at the mansion, and Richard trusted his opinion more than anyone else's. Each session with Dr. Keller followed a similar routine. He would enter the playroom where Leo waited quietly, surrounded by soft toys and educational tools. Keller would speak in calm tones, trying to trigger any reaction, but Leo usually just sat still, staring at nothing. Richard watched some sessions through the security cameras, always hoping to see something different. Keller always left with the same comments that things were progressing slowly, but there were small signs of improvement. As the months went by, the mansion remained quiet. Richard barely left the estate. Every part of his attention was directed toward Leo. But while Richard believed Keller was doing everything possible to help his son, the truth was different. Keller often stretched the length of sessions without real purpose. He repeated exercises that had no effect and took detailed notes filled with complex language that didn't reflect any real progress. In reality, he knew Leo wasn't responding to his methods, and he didn't mind. As long as Richard kept paying him, Keller was content. He saw the Wakefield family as a long-term opportunity. Keller's true motivation wasn't helping Leo. It was maintaining the illusion of progress to keep the sessions going as long as possible. Julia Bennett arrived at the Wakefield mansion on a quiet Tuesday morning. She had been hired as a housemaid to help with basic tasks around the large estate. The place was beautiful, but felt strangely lifeless. Julia noticed that right away. The staff she met were polite, but distant. Everyone spoke in low voices and avoided making noise. She was told early on to be careful not to disturb Leo, the boy of the house. Julia saw Leo for the first time on her second day. He was sitting on the floor of a large room surrounded by toys that looked brand new. None of them had been touched. He stared at the floor and didn't react when she entered. Julia didn't try to talk to him. She didn't get close or force interaction. She simply cleaned around him slowly and calmly, letting him see that she was there. Julia could sense that Leo wasn't just dealing with autism. There was a heavy sadness in his expression, a deep loneliness that seemed to fill the room. So instead of treating him like a problem to be solved, she chose to stay near without asking anything in return. Her presence was soft and steady, and day by day she kept showing up the same way. Richard quickly noticed that Julia was different from the other employees. She didn't rush, didn't complain, and didn't act afraid of being around Leo. There was a calmness about her that made the mansion feel less tense. For the first time in months, Richard felt something change. He began to think that maybe her presence was helping in a way no one had before. Eventually, Dr. Keller learned that a new maid had been hired. When he realized Julia had been spending time around Leo, he gave a carefully worded warning. He said that people without clinical training could unintentionally interfere with therapy. Richard, unsure of what to believe, nodded but didn't make any changes. To Keller, Julia was more than a maid. She was a variable he couldn't control. More importantly, Keller felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of threat. Without any training, without medical tools or theories, she was connecting with Leo in a way Keller had never managed to do. Julia was cleaning the hallway near the playroom, following her usual routine. As she stepped back to move around the corner, one of the cloths slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. That's when she noticed something different. Leo, who was sitting nearby on a soft rug, looked in her direction and smiled just a little. It wasn't big or long, but it was clear. A small curve of his lips. That brief moment stayed in her mind. For the rest of the afternoon, she watched from a distance, just doing her work. Julia believed something important had happened, a tiny step, but a real one. Eventually, Julia shared the moment with one of the older maids. The comment reached Richard. Curious, he asked Julia about it. Did Leo really smile? He asked almost in a whisper. Julia paused, then nodded softly. It was very small and very fast, but yes, I think so. When Richard mentioned it to Dr. Keller, the therapist didn't smile or show any excitement. He crossed his arms and spoke with his usual calm tone. That's not progress, he said. Children like Leo often show random movements. A smile can be a reflex. Don't confuse it with real improvement. One afternoon, while tidying the floor in the playroom, Julia noticed Leo was sitting in his usual spot, lining up colored blocks in a straight line. Julia decided to do something different. She grabbed another set of blocks and began copying his actions, placing them in a line beside his. She stayed quiet, just matching his movements at her own pace. After a few minutes, she noticed Leo glance at her. Then, after a short pause, he picked another block and continued. Julia did the same. For several minutes, they lined up blocks together in silence. This moment felt meaningful to Julia. She realized she had found a way to gently enter Leo's world, not by forcing him to change, but by respecting what he already did. Julia began using this approach more often. When she noticed him spinning a toy car, she would spin another toy car nearby. If he tapped his fingers on a surface, she would gently tap the same way. Sometimes he would stop and look at her, not with fear, but with interest. Over time, the boy's eyes began to follow her movements more frequently. Richard, who often passed by the room, started noticing the difference too. One morning, Richard finally stepped into the room while Julia and Leo were playing with wooden shapes. He watched as Julia patiently followed Leo's actions, always a step behind, always respectful. Leo didn't push her away. He stayed right there. Richard was surprised by how peaceful the scene was. When Dr. Keller visited the mansion later that week, Richard brought up Julia's interactions with Leo. Instead of showing interest, Keller frowned slightly and interrupted. "That's not helpful," he said. "Allowing a maid to mimic behavior like that only reinforces repetitive patterns. It's counterproductive." It was a normal afternoon in the kitchen. Julia was cleaning the counters while Leo sat quietly at the table. There was a bucket of soapy water nearby, filled with foam from the dishes she had just finished. Julia was in a playful mood. Wanting to make the cleaning feel lighter, she picked up the bucket and gently placed it on her head like a hat. Foam spilled down the sides. She turned to Leo with a funny face and said, "Look at my new hat." For a second, Leo just stared. Then something completely unexpected happened. His face lit up and he started laughing. It wasn't just a small smile or a soft giggle. He burst out laughing loudly from deep inside. Julia froze in surprise. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was real. Leo didn't stop at just laughing. After a few seconds, he stood up and walked toward the counter. Without any help, he climbed carefully onto the counter and reached for another empty bucket. To everyone's surprise, Leo put the bucket on his own head, just like Julia had done. Water and soap spilled down the sides, covering his face and shoulders, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he started laughing again, even louder this time. At that moment, Richard entered the kitchen and saw the scene. He froze. Leo was laughing, soaked with water, a bucket on his head, smiling like a different child. Richard's eyes filled with tears. It didn't look like therapy. It didn't look like anything scientific, but it was real. Richard stood by the door, covering his mouth with his hand, overcome with emotion. Later that evening, Richard couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. So when Keller came for his scheduled session, Richard brought it up. He described everything: the foam, the bucket, the laughter, even how Leo had copied Julia. Keller listened without showing much emotion. When Richard finished, Keller gave a small smirk and said, "That's dangerous and irresponsible. You're letting him associate nonsense behavior with fun. It can delay real progress." Richard was walking through the hallway when something unexpected happened. He heard fast footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around fully, he felt small arms wrap around his waist. Leo was hugging him. Not a light touch, not guided by anyone, but a real hug, spontaneous. Leo had never done that before. Richard stood there shocked, afraid that moving too quickly might ruin the moment. Slowly he lowered his hands and hugged his son back gently. Leo stayed there for a few seconds, then stepped away and looked up at his father without any fear. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Julia was nearby and had seen it all. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," Julia replied calmly. "He came to you on his own." Julia explained that earlier that day she and Leo had been playing with cushions. They had created a small game where Leo would throw a pillow at her and she would pretend to fall. It made him laugh. After a while, he started bringing the pillow to her, then gently leaning against her. "I think he's starting to feel safe," she said. "Maybe now he's learning how to show affection in his own way." When Keller arrived for his next scheduled visit, Richard mentioned the hug. Keller listened with a tight expression. He nodded slowly, then said, "I understand why that feels meaningful, but you need to be careful. Sometimes when children on the spectrum are overstimulated, they can display unusual behavior. It doesn't always mean progress." Keller continued, "The real issue is Julia. She's not trained. She doesn't understand the risks." Then, with a colder tone, he added, "I think you should also ask yourself why Julia is so invested in your son. She may enjoy the attention. People with no background often get involved for the wrong reasons." That night, Richard sat alone in his study, thinking. He replayed the moment when Leo hugged him over and over in his mind. It wasn't just an emotional reaction, it was real. Keller's words had sounded more like jealousy than concern. Richard remembered how Julia had never once asked for praise. She just showed up every day and gave her best to Leo without expecting anything. Slowly, Richard's trust in Keller started to weaken. Leo's days were no longer silent. Now the boy laughed freely, played with toys, and even said simple words like ball, more, and water. Julia continued to play with him every day. Richard now joined in too. He would sit on the floor, roll a ball to Leo, or hold up pictures while naming them slowly. The cold mansion that once felt like a museum now echoed with laughter and the sounds of a father finally getting to know his son. But not everyone felt the same. Dr. Keller watched all of this unfold with growing anger. The more progress Leo showed, the less control Keller seemed to have. He couldn't deny that the boy was improving, but it wasn't happening inside the therapy room. It was coming from games, music, and emotional connection, things he had always considered distractions. Keller began pushing back. He told Richard that Leo's behavior was unstable and that only clinical structure could guide real development. He started suggesting more sessions. Richard hesitated. He didn't want to upset Keller, but he also couldn't ignore the results. Leo was smiling, playing, and saying words, and none of that had come from therapy scripts or tests. One afternoon, when Julia was alone in the kitchen preparing lunch, Keller entered and closed the door behind him. He didn't shout. His tone was low and cold. He looked her in the eyes and said, "You don't understand what you're doing. You're interfering with a process you know nothing about. If you keep going, I can make sure you lose this job." Julia stood still. She didn't respond, but something changed inside her at that moment. For the first time, she clearly saw Keller's true face. Over the next few days, she watched Keller with sharper eyes. She noticed how he only spoke with authority, never warmth. He always referred to Leo in technical terms, never as a child, but as a subject. He never laughed, never celebrated the boy's small victories, and never asked how Leo felt. Richard started sensing the tension. He saw the difference between Keller's stiff approach and Julia's honest care. He watched how Leo smiled whenever Julia entered the room, how his posture relaxed. With Keller, Leo returned to stillness. So, when Keller demanded another series of expensive sessions, Richard paused. He no longer said yes immediately. He started asking more questions. And when Richard finally learned about the warning Keller gave Julia, something inside him changed completely. He was done being manipulated. He realized he had trusted the wrong person for too long. The future of his son would no longer be built on fear or control. From now on, it would be built on trust. A few weeks later, Richard invited 2 new specialists to the mansion. They were not connected to Keller and came from respected clinics in another city. When the specialists arrived, they observed Leo without interfering. After several days, they gave Richard their opinion. Leo was clearly developing. The way he reacted to Julia's presence and to his father's attention was strong evidence of emotional progress. Julia was praised for her calm approach and creativity. One of the doctors even said, "Whatever she's doing, it's working, and it's working well." Julia didn't know what to say. She had never asked for attention or recognition. She only wanted Leo to be happy. Richard was sitting beside her and looked at her with tears in his eyes. "You gave this family something I thought was lost," he said. While the household felt lighter and more hopeful, Keller grew more desperate. Then one morning, he decided to make a final move. He started spreading lies. He told a few staff members that Julia was manipulating Leo, teaching him to act a certain way just to make herself look good. Richard found out about the rumors within days, so he called the new specialists again and asked them clearly, "Is there any chance Leo's reactions are fake or forced?" The doctors looked surprised. "Absolutely not," one said. "We've observed him independently. The joy, the words, the laughter, all of it is genuine. Children can't fake that level of connection." The next morning, Richard called Keller to his office. The conversation was short and quiet. Richard didn't yell. He simply asked direct questions. Keller tried to defend himself, but Richard had already made up his mind. "You lied," he said, "not just about Julia, but about my son. You never believed in him. You believed in yourself." Richard told him clearly that his services were no longer needed. Keller left the mansion that same day. After Keller's departure, things settled into a peaceful rhythm. The atmosphere in the mansion was warm. Leo continued to grow. Every week there was a new word, a new sound, a new game. Richard started planning small family trips. Julia stayed by Leo's side through it all. She remained humble, never asking for more than what she already had. a place in Leo's world. Months had passed, and Leo was a completely different boy. He was now attending a small school nearby, one that welcomed children with different learning needs. Julia went with him every morning, and Richard often joined when he could. Leo participated in classroom activities, listened to songs with the other children, and even joined in small performances. The teachers were surprised at how quickly he adapted. Back at home, Leo's laughter filled every hallway of the mansion. The silence that once covered the house had truly disappeared. Julia, once just a housemaid, now sat with them during meals. She was no longer just an employee. She was treated like family. The memory of the kitchen moment, the day Julia put a soapy bucket on her head and made Leo laugh for the first time, was now seen as the beginning of everything. Richard kept a photo of that day framed in his office. It reminded him of how far they had come. Whenever someone asked about Leo's progress, Richard told them about the bucket. "That's when our real journey started," he would say. As for Keller, he had disappeared from their lives completely. After being removed from Leo's case, word started to spread in the professional community. Other families began to come forward, investigations began, reports were written. His name, once respected, was now questioned everywhere. The truth was out. Keller hadn't believed in his patients, he had believed in control. One afternoon, while sitting on the back porch, Richard looked at Leo playing in the garden. Julia was sitting nearby reading a book. Leo was chasing butterflies, laughing loudly and calling out their colors. Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He realized something deep. Autism had never been the enemy. The real obstacle had been fear, and people like Keller who used that fear for control. Leo didn't need fixing. He needed understanding, space, trust, and connection. Julia had given that to him. And through Leo's journey, Richard had learned how to be a father, not a perfect one, but a present one. Now the future didn't feel heavy anymore. There were still challenges ahead, and Richard knew that. But he no longer faced them with panic. He faced them with hope. Leo would continue to grow at his own pace, and whatever came next, they would handle it together. The mansion, once cold and silent, had become a place of joy, of growth, of family. The problem had never been Leo. The problem had been the people who couldn't see his potential. Keller had worn the mask of a professional, but he had never truly believed in the boy. Julia had no degrees, no titles, but she had believed from the start, and that made all the difference. Leo's laughter was now the soundtrack of their home, proof that love had won. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.